morning. Let's all stand together as we worship. The cross before me, the world behind. No turning back, raise the banner high. It's not for me, it's all for you. Let the heavens shake and split the sky. Let the people clap their hands and cry. It's not for us, it's all for you. Not to us, but to your name be the glory. Not to us, but to your name be the glory. Our hearts unfold before your throne, the only place for those who know. It's not for us, it's all for you. Send your holy fire on this offering. Let our worship burn for the world to see. It's not for us, it's all for you. Not to us, but to your name be glory. Not to us, but to your name be glory. Not to us, but to your name be glory. Not to us, but to your name be glory. The earth is shaking, the mountains shouting, it's all for you. The waves are crashing, the sun is raging, it's all for you. The universe is spinning and singing, it's all for you. Your children dancing, 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 it's all for you, it's all for you. Not to us, but to your name be glory. Not to us, but to your name be glory. Not to us, but to your name be glory. Not to us, but to your name be glory. The earth is shaking, the mountains shouting, it's all for you. The waves are crashing, the sun is raging, it's all for you. The universe is spinning and singing, it's all for you. Your children dancing, 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 it's all for you, it's all for you. Not to us, but to your name be the glory. Not to us, but to your name be the glory. Amen. Give us praise this morning. Alone in my sorrow and dead in my sin, lost without hope with no place to begin. Your love made a way to let mercy come in. When death was arrested and my life began, ash was redeemed, only beauty remains. My orphan heart was given name. My mourning grew quiet, my feet rose to dance. When death was arrested and my life began. Oh, your grace, sun free, was your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new, now life begins with you. Let's stand together. Released from my chains, I'm a prisoner no more. My shame was a ransom he faithfully bore. He canceled my debt and he called me his friend. When I was arrested and my life began. Oh, your grace so free washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new, now life begins with you. Our Savior displayed on the criminal's cross. Darkness rejoiced as though heaven had fallen. But then Jesus rose with our freedom in hand. That's when death was arrested and my life began. Oh, your grace so free washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new, now life begins with you. Oh, we're free, free, forever we're free. Come join the song of all the redeemed. Yes, we're free, free, forever, amen. When death was arrested and my life began. Oh, we're free, free, forever we're free. Come join the song of all the redeemed. Yes, we're free, free, forever, amen. When death was arrested and my life began. When death was arrested and my life began. When death was arrested and my life began. Amen. Amen.
Anybody ever gotten any bad advice? Or given bad advice? I mean, with people close to us, it really hurts. We're like, what are you thinking? But I mean, then there's the everyday bad advice. Like, you go to Home Depot and you're looking for something, and then you can't find it, and you're not sure if it'll do what you think it's going to do, and so you ask somebody that works there, and it takes about 10 seconds before you realize you clearly know more than the person trying to give you advice. And you're like, no, that's okay, I'll get it myself. Right. It's even worse in electronics stores, because obviously if you work in an electronics store and you took a 6-week class on how electronics work, they all of a sudden act like they know more than everybody in the world, and you just want a TV that'll work, and you feel like you walk out of there with the space shuttle that'll do this and it'll do that and whatever, and you realize it's not what you asked for in the first place, and so you feel like you were kind of given a bum advice, and then they try to sell the extended warranty to you, and I know what's going through your mind. Well, if I bought it, shouldn't it work? And if it goes bad, shouldn't you give me a new one without buying that? Of course. The worst bad advice I got was, I think we just got done moving from another state, and taxes are hard anyway if you're a pastor because you're self-employed and you got to do all these things. And then we moved from another state, and so I had taxes from, I think it was Minnesota and Ohio, and we had to do all that, and I was a pastor and self-employed, and so we thought, you know what, we'll go somewhere. Well, a big mistake. I went to the H&R Block station set up in a Sears. And let's just say that like a half hour in of us just both sitting there, the lady's asking me questions on how to do stuff. And I was already in there, and I already signed on the dotted line to let them pay for it, and it was bad. They gave me bad advice, whatever. Luckily, the corporate headquarters later on sent us like an email and said, the person you were working with messed this up and this up and this up. You're actually going to get more money back than you thought or whatever. But the whole reason I went there was peace of mind. And let's just say I did not leave with it by all the questions they were asking. We just wish people would say, I don't know. Or even better, I'm not sure, but let me find out for you, right? That's all we want to hear. We don't want to hear, yeah, when I was little, my grandpa was an accountant, and he told me that. Like, you just don't. Now, luckily with me, if you're talking to me, that's not a danger, because I'm not like a way talkative person. And so, rather than just spew a bunch of stuff, I'm going to be like, got me. Hopefully, I'm going to give you a hug or put my arm and say, you know what, let's figure it out together. That's all we really want, right? So we think of bad advice from people at large. We think of bad advice from friends. And of course, that brings us back to Job and all his friends trying to give him advice and sometimes not making him feel better. And to recap, the first week we talked about God and Satan talking together. We talked about God allowing Satan to test Job. And we talked about Job crying out to God because bad things are happening to him. And then the last 3 weeks were all about Job's 3 friends, right? Each week there was a friend, and they had 3 different conversations with him, and they're talking, and we find out how good his friends are or aren't. Let me point out that at the beginning of it all, when the stuff was happening to Job, they did, like for a week or more, fast with him and cry with him and do whatever. But then when it got to the advice part, maybe they should have took my advice and just put their arm around him and said, it's okay, buddy. But they didn't. So that brings us to this week. This is another friend. But he waited his turn. He waits his turn. Patiently, like maybe he had a little bit more smarts than those other 3, and he's listening to him, and he's like, oh man, what kind of advice are these guys giving? And here is the next guy up, and you're going to be excited because then next week it's the end. We're going to hear from Job's last friend. I don't mean that he doesn't have any more friends, but the last friend that we talk about in the Bible. And then next week, we hear from God. I know that's what we're all waiting for, because we're like, that guy clearly was not giving good advice, and that guy didn't do it, and that guy didn't do it. We're going to see what this guy has to say, but like really everybody wants to hear from God, right? And that's what's going to be next week. And if you open up the book of Job and think, yes, I'll read it, or no, I won't read it, it looks like a long book, we're finally almost there. Like just by talking about a little bit of the conversations, we've gotten there to where it's the end, and we're going to hear from God. But one more friend to hear from. And now, at the end of last week, we saw the last words we read and the words of Job were ended. So we're just going to hear from the friend. We're not even going to hear what Job has to say about it. But this guy's been patient. He's waited his turn. Kind of impressive. You get a group of guys, and to have one of them in the friend group just be quiet and listen, like that's almost non-existent. I mean, talk about sports. It's about 2.5 seconds before everyone else is interrupted and everyone's giving their opinion. This guy waits and waits and waits. He waits through 3 conversations between 3 other friends. And here it is. We're going to start in Job chapter 32. It's a little easier to follow along this week because it's just straight through starting in 32. Now, we're not going to read it all, but we'll flip a little bit at a time. This is Job's next friend. I don't know how to say it. It's Elihu, I think. That's what I'm calling it. I'm pretty confident in that. It's kind of like when you give advice when you don't know what you're talking about, right? Elihu. I can spell it, but it doesn't matter. His friend. So in chapter 32, starting right at the beginning of it. So these 3 men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then Elihu, son of Barachel the Buzite, of the family of Ram, became angry. He was angry at Job because he justified himself rather than God. He was angry also at Job's 3 friends because they had found no answer, though they had declared Job to be in the wrong. Now Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he, But when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouths of these three men, he became angry. And he goes on, I am young in years, and you are aged. Therefore I was timid and afraid to declare my opinion to you. Sounds pretty wise so far. And then it picks up in verse 12. I gave you my attention, but there was in fact no one that confuted Job. No one among you that answered his words. So he just called out all of Job's friends. He's getting mad now. It's like, you didn't answer him. You told Job he was wrong, but nothing you said made any sense and proved that he was wrong. Nobody. Did you hear? I like at the beginning of that. The three friends couldn't answer because Job was righteous in his own eyes. Did you ever talk to a friend who knew that they were right? Could you convince them of anything else in the world? Well, at this point, that's Job. I'm not saying whether Job was right or wrong, but in his own eyes, he's right, and he's right before God. The funny thing is whether someone's right or not, they act the same. You try to convince that friend that they're wrong. When they know that they're right, you could say everything. You could give any facts, any evidence, or whatever. It doesn't matter, does it? You can't convince them. So the three friends could not convince Job because Job was right in his own eyes. They couldn't change his mind. And then the fourth friend became angry. He was angry at Job for justifying himself rather than God. And he was angry at the friends because they didn't have an answer, but they were still talking anyway. Right? No one likes that. You're not saying anything, you're still talking. So he waited his turn patiently rather than just scream his opinion when everyone else was. So far, this friend, I'm liking him better than the other ones. He's younger, so he's like, I'm going to let these people talk. They probably know more than me because I'm young. He was wise enough to do that. He was wise enough to be calm and patient until he finally got angry because all these people supposedly helping Job had nothing to say, nothing important to say. Then he goes on in chapter 33, starting with 1. But now hear my speech, O Job, and listen to all my words. See, I open my mouth, the tongue of my mouth speaks. My words declare the uprightness of my heart, and what my lips know they speak sincerely. The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. Answer me if you can. Set your words in order before me. Take your stand. See, before God I am as you are. I too was formed from a piece of clay. No fear of me need terrify you. My pressure will not be heavy on you. Pressure will not be heavy on you. Then he goes on in verse 31. Pay heed, Job, listen to me. Be silent and I will speak. If you have anything to say, answer me. Speak, for I desire to justify you. If not, listen to me. Be silent and I will teach you wisdom. So far, he has some good things to say. Did you hear that? He said he speaks sincerely. He brings out a point to say it. He's not just hollering at Job. He said, no need to fear. I'm not going to bash on you like the other three friends did. He said, God made us both. He made us both the same. We're on the same team. They're both on the side of God. And he says this out loud. He said, Job, you are on the side of God. I am on the side of God. You have nothing to fear. And then he says, what I think is the most impressive, he says, he desires to justify Job. He wants Job to be in the right. He wants to figure this out together. He came alongside of him. Now, he didn't say, I don't know when we're going to figure it out. He said, we're going to figure this out. And we go on in 34, chapter 34, starting with verse 10. Therefore, hear me, you have sense. Far be it from God that he should do wickedness, from the Almighty that he should do wrong. For according to their deeds he will repay them, and according to their ways he will make it befall them. Of a truth, God will not do wickedly, and the Almighty will not pervert justice. Who gave him charge over the earth? And who laid on him the whole world? If he should take back his spirit to himself and gather to himself his breath, all flesh would perish together, and all mortals would return to dust. His friend basically says truth here. He said, God is just. He behaves perfectly. He is not wicked. He doesn't sit up there and do bad things to good people just because he can. It says he always behaves perfectly. He is not wickedly. So far, he's not said anything that is not completely true. Then in chapter 35, he continues, starting in verses 4 going through 8. I will answer you and your friends with you. Look at the heavens and see. Observe the clouds which are higher than you. If you have sinned, what do you accomplish against him? And if your transgressions are multiplied, what do you do to him? If you are righteous, what do you give to him? Or what does he receive from your hand? Your wickedness affects others like you, and your righteousness other human beings. Do you catch that? God does not pervert justice, is what he's saying. He's saying it over and over again. Things that are just will work justly. And then he says this, and this is, we forget this sometimes. He said, God doesn't need anything from you. God doesn't need anything from me. He doesn't need anything from any of us. He's totally self-sufficient. He wants things for us. He wants us to be involved in what he's doing, but he does not need anything from us. So our deeds, whether they're wicked or righteous, they don't affect God the way they affect other people. When we're wicked, who suffers? The people around us. When we do good things, who does it help? The people around us. Why? Because God doesn't need our help. He wants us to be involved, but he doesn't need it. So all these things, and when Job's crying out, it's between him and God and whether he's righteous or not, but it affects all these other people. And that's what his friend's saying. He's saying God doesn't need us. He created everything. He doesn't need your advice on how to do it. You affect other people. He's right on. Then in chapter 36, starting in verse 2, bear with me a little and I will show you, for I have yet something to say on God's behalf. This is where it gets a little tricky for me. Did you hear him? He said he's speaking on God's behalf. How do you like to do that tomorrow? How'd you like to go, I don't know, get out your YouTube channel, do whatever you do, call your friends and say, I'm speaking on behalf of God now. I don't know about you. I'm not sure who would do it that way, but I might be afraid of a bolt of lightning or something. Because once you say that, it's on. You better be right. He said, I am speaking on God's behalf. On God's behalf. And then he continues on in verse 11 and 12. If they listen and serve him, they complete their days in prosperity and their years in pleasantness. But if they do not listen, they shall perish by the sword and die without knowledge. Did you see what just happened? He went right to the commonly held belief that everyone else had. That if you seek God, then all's going to be well, and you're going to have possessions, and you're going to be happy, and everything's going to be great. And if you're wicked, you're certainly going to die by the sword. Not only did he say this commonly held belief that everybody believes, but before it, he said, I'm speaking for God now. So mistake number 2. He didn't hear directly from God, because as we talked about in weeks past, that is not what the Bible promises. It doesn't promise you give your life to God and do good things, and then you're going to have a lot of money and riches and fame, and you're going to be happy and all this stuff. He just doesn't say that. It doesn't say that anyway. Now, part of it's true, that if you don't listen to God and you don't serve him, you're going to die without knowledge. I mean, that is true. Because if you're not seeking God, you're not going to hear the truth. But this is where he starts to step over the line. He now is with everyone else, and he's back to the same tune. Job, everything's been taken away from you. It must be your fault. You must not be righteous before God because these bad things are happening to you. If you were still doing good things like you claim, you would be happy, and you would have all your livestock, and you would have your family, and everything would be peachy. We just know that this isn't true. I'd like to note to you that Job is still being quiet. He's already had his round with the 3 other friends. He's already talked back and forth with them. He's just going to sit and listen to him talk. Chapter 37. He's almost done. He's almost done talking. Starting in verse 14. Hear this, O Job. Stop and consider the wondrous works of God. Do you know how God lays his command upon them and causes the lightning of his cloud to shine? Do you know the balancings of the clouds, the wondrous works of the one whose knowledge is perfect? You whose garments are hot when the earth is still because of the south wind. Can you, like him, spread out the skies, hard as a molten mirror? Teach us what we shall say to him. We cannot draw up our case because of darkness. Should he be told that I want to speak? Did anyone ever wish to be swallowed up? And then in verse 23, the Almighty, we cannot find him. He is great in power and justice, and abundant righteousness he will not violate. More truth, at least. So God made everything, right? He ordered everything. He made lots of things we can't comprehend. That's why I believe in science, like I said, because it's so amazing. The more I see science and the more I study it, the more I believe in God, because I'm like, how can all this be? He ordered every little thing. And then he says, so this is the God that created everything in the earth and the God of the universe. Should you demand to be heard? Because that's what Job's doing, right? He said, please answer me, God. If you've ever read the book of Esther, do you know what it's like back in that time to approach even a king when he didn't speak to you first? It meant you could die. When Esther went to the king, they said, don't do that. You got to wait until the king addresses you, and then you can speak to him. Because back then, if you did that in the wrong order and you just approached the king and spoke to him, you could be killed on the spot. Knowing that, for Job to cry over and over again, God, please speak to me. God, where are you? God, why are you hiding from me? That's why he says, do you wish to be destroyed? How do you speak to God like that? And then his friend says, we cannot find God. Part of this is theological, and part of this is just that we don't know enough. But he kind of says in there that our presence would add sin to God's presence. Remember that we did the thing with the water before, and God's pure and holy, and the water's all pure. And if you add one drop of sin, it clouds the whole thing. That's what his friend's saying. He said, you can't go stand next to God and talk to him like a man, because your presence would add sin to God, and then he would no longer be sinless. So we cannot find God. Now, he said a lot of truth in here, but he said other things that, frankly, I think he's drawn upon, well, I think this is the way it is, and so I'm going to declare to you. The problem is that his friend said, I am speaking for God, and on God's behalf. Do you think God needs somebody to speak on his behalf? That kind of makes me laugh a little bit. It's like picking an expert in the field of neuroscience and me standing up with all my little knowledge and saying, I'm speaking on the behalf of this great neuroscience person. I'm going to tell you what they think and what they believe, even though I don't have a clue. Pretty dangerous. Pretty dangerous. There's a few conclusions we get from this stuff in here this week. Don't offer advice when you don't know what you're talking about. It's that simple. Just don't offer it. You're not helping. What's your goal? To sound smart? If it's to help, you're not helping because you don't know. Offer comfort instead. Don't offer advice when you know what you're talking about. Offer comfort. Everyone can do that. Speak as if we're all on the same side. This is why this friend sounds way better. He said, Job, you and I are the same. We're both on God's side, which makes us all on the same side. You can talk about lots of things you don't agree on when you put out front that we're all on the same side, right? It goes a lot better. If you're already enemies and then you disagree, it gets bad. God doesn't need anything from us. God doesn't need anything from us. He wants us to be involved, and he wants things for us, but he doesn't need anything from us. So if you act like if you don't do this one thing, then God's will is not going to be accomplished. So wrong. If God wants it done, he's going to do it through whoever will do it. But he doesn't need you. He wants you to be involved. But our actions affect God's people. Everyone else. The good helps them, the bad hurts them. And the last truth I get from this is about the grain of truth. A grain of truth doesn't make all true. Did his friend not have some good things to say? Yes, he did. Was it all true? No, it was not. And sometimes we act like that. We act like we have this little bit of truth, and then we spin it, and then we spin it, and then we spin it, and then we claim that because there was that one little truth in it, that everything we say is true, and everything we say is from God. And it's just not. A grain of truth doesn't make everything that's said true. Does anybody, have you heard of the name Nostradamus? In I think the late 80s, his name was big because the Cold War was going on with Russia. And we're worried about all the time about nuclear weapons and them firing theirs and us firing ours. And so there was Nostradamus. And he was a famous guy that made a bunch of predictions, basically. And he had these whole writings in a book. And he predicted all these things. Kind of. The problem is he wrote them all in like poems, and they called them quatrains. And so they could easily be interpreted kind of to mean whatever you wanted them to mean. But Nostradamus became known because if you spun it the right way, he talked about a lot of things that came true later. I'm sure, and as we know, he predicted a lot of things that did not come true. But some of the things he kind of predicted the death of King Henry II. The quatrain, well, it says this is how he died. He held a tournament to celebrate a recent peace treaty, and during a joust with one of his young soldiers, his young soldier's lance, the jousting thing, shattered, driving splinters into the king's eye and skull. And so he died at a charity event. I know, repay good with evil, whatever, that's about the definition. But this is how people said that his prediction came true. This is all he said in his little poem here. The young lion will overcome the older one, that he will pierce his eyes through a golden cage, and that 2 wounds will ensure a cruel death. So based on that vague prediction, people are like, oh, Nostradamus knows what he's talking about. Later on, he supposedly predicted the Great Fire of London, because there was a big fire that swallowed things up. This was his poem for that. The blood of the just will commit a fault in London, burnt through lightning of 23's the 6th. The ancient lady will fall from her high place. Several of the same sect will be killed. And so they did their math, and they're like, 20 times 3 plus 6, that equals 66. So the Great London Fire in 1966, he predicted that. There's several others talked about that he predicted Hitler was coming. From the depths of the west of Europe, a young child will be born of poor people. He will, by his tongue, seduce a great troop, and his fame will spread far beyond Europe. You could. I mean, if you want to believe, it's there. And then lastly, they thought that he predicted the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Within 2 cities, there will be scourges the like of which was never seen. There will be famine and plague, people put out by steel. He's making vague predictions that you could put into any situation and say, hey, look, I was right. And what you're forgetting about is that in the 80s, we were really nervous because we heard that there was this famous guy named Nostradamus who made all these predictions that came true. And from what we read in his other stuff, it looks like we're going to die from nuclear war. Like in the 80s, like they were predicting like the date and stuff based on poems that this guy wrote. Because there's a little bit of grains that could be truth, and then we take all the rest of it, and we get all whipped up into a frenzy. Well, that's what I'm talking about us. When we look like experts, when people think we are, whether it's right or wrong, people pay close attention. They just do, because they want to hear things, and it's a great responsibility. And we do have the greatest thing to offer. We have the hope of Jesus Christ. Well, let me tell you about the hope of Jesus Christ. It's attractive all by itself. I don't have to dress it up. I don't have to make this prediction. I don't have to say I'm speaking for God and add a bunch of things to it. It's attractive all by itself if I don't say a word. The rocks will cry out and talk about the hope of Jesus Christ. So when we add to the hope of Jesus Christ with our little truths of things that we said are right, and every generation has had their cross to bear, that music is evil. God says he doesn't like that music. Whatever it is. Anything. When we add our truth to this thing that's already attractive on its own, that is 100% true, and we add our things that's our truth that may or may not be true, it tarnishes the whole thing. We just confuse people. They're like, oh, I see, and usually, tell me if I'm wrong, usually they figure it out for themselves. Man, I'm really excited. I heard, or I read, or I discovered this truth about Jesus. Is this really true, or whatever? And they want explanation, and they're really excited. They found it all on their own, and then we add all these things. We add all these rules, and you have to do this, and you have to stop doing this, and whatever. We're ruining it for them. We should be excited. Oh, you found that truth. I remember finding that truth. So exciting. Let's go celebrate. And then we add things that they're supposed to do and they're not supposed to do. And they just get confused because we look like experts, because we go to church every week and we proclaim the same truth. And then if we add, if we're not an expert, but we talk our way anyway, it always ends badly. It confuses people. Why do they say people leave the church or walk away from God? Is it ever because of God? No, it's because of the people. Because we add all these things to it. We say all these things that don't need to be said. I'm not saying you're not allowed to give advice. What did Paul do in the Bible? Do you remember? Sometimes he spoke and he said, I, not the Lord, say this. He's saying, to the best of my ability, from what I've read about God's word and all this, I say this. I could be wrong, but this is what I say. And then other times he said, this is from God. I've read it straight from it. I'm not having to interpret it. This is it. This is directly from God. We need to clarify what is from God and what is from, I call it, us as best we know it. There's nothing wrong with that. We're all trying to figure out life. We're all trying to figure out exactly what God said. It's okay to admit that. It's okay to admit, I don't know that, but let's try to figure it out together. Rather than say, well, this says this and this means this, whatever, and it just confuses people. They want to see you be humble. They want to see us be humble. I want to figure it out together. Be careful when you're speaking on the behalf of God. Because you do have truth, but that little grain of truth that you have doesn't mean that everything else that comes out of your mouth is true. But from other people, that's what they're going to think if you don't clarify first. If you say, I think it would probably be good if you didn't do this. I think that might be a bad thing to do. But never, well, God says you shouldn't do this, and anybody who does is going to hell. It doesn't work. It doesn't. You have this thing that people are attracted to naturally, that all of a sudden, if they're wanting to shy away from it, that's on us. That's not on God. I haven't met anybody that just sees the raw hope and power of Jesus Christ and then all of a sudden decides, well, I don't know. I mean, there's people that turn it down, but not because they're confused about it or whatever. They see what it is and they want it or they don't want it. But we can't convince people more. We could say, yeah, this was my life before, this is my life after. See what he's done for me. He can do the same for you. Don't confuse people with a grain of truth with your own added things.
Yeah, I need you to fight for me when I don't know what I believe. Yeah, hey, why does everybody leave? Show me what it's like to dream. Hey, go, you the best. Hey, say it with the chest. Hey, yeah, wave 'em high, side to side. Let 'em know we gon' rise, we gon' shine. Hey, I need you to fight for me. Hey, I know you're my therapy. I know why we fight. It's just to know we tried. I eat drops. How do I start it off? Pulling all these hours, trying to keep it all clear. I got way too many thoughts, but in these expectations got me feeling stuck like